was halfway up a ladder, setting the last frame beam on my red barn, when tires screamed and an SUV slid to a stop along my fence like it owned the place. I remember thinking it was odd, because nobody ever comes down that gravel stretch unless they're lost. Then the driver's door flew open. Out stepped a woman with stiff posture and sharper eyes, clutching a thick binder to her chest like it was a badge. She didn't even introduce herself. She just pointed at my barn and said, "That structure violates HOA code and fines will be issued immediately." Her name was Marjorie Bell, president of the Hollow Creek Estates HOA. According to her, my barn was unapproved, non-compliant, and an eyesore. According to me, she was standing at the edge of land my family had owned since 1889, long before her subdivision, her rules, or that binder ever existed. At first I was stunned, then something shifted. Because the calmer she got, the clearer it became. She had no idea who she was threatening. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. The fine was massive, and that's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a fight. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? To understand why that fine hit me the way it did, you have to understand the land itself. This wasn't some weekend purchase or a speculative lot I picked up on a whim. This property had been in my family since before cars, before zoning maps, before anyone thought to put a gate and a logo on a neighborhood entrance. My great-great-grandfather settled it in 1889, cleared it by hand, and built the first farmhouse with timber pulled straight from the back acres. Every generation after him added something: a shed, a fence line, a new well, always careful to keep the land working and alive. I grew up hearing stories about it at the dinner table, how my grandfather used to say the soil here could feed a family even in bad years, how my father taught me to mend fence before he ever let me drive. When I took over, I didn't change much. I ran a small farm operation, eggs, seasonal produce, a few livestock projects, nothing flashy. Just honest work that paid the bills and kept the land productive. The barn I was building wasn't a luxury. It was necessary. I needed proper shelter for equipment, feed, and animals. Without it, the whole operation slowed to a crawl. The irony was that for most of my life, nobody bothered me about any of this. Then, about 25 years ago, a developer bought up the surrounding parcels and carved them into neat little rectangles. Hollow Creek Estates popped up almost overnight. Matching mailboxes, decorative street lamps, and eventually an HOA with rules thick enough to stop a door. My land ended up wrapped on 3 sides by that subdivision, like an island they never quite managed to claim. At first, the HOA mostly ignored me. I wasn't part of their meetings, didn't use their roads, didn't sign anything. But as the years went on and leadership changed, that indifference slowly turned into irritation. I started getting emails addressed to homeowner, reminding me to keep my property visually consistent with community standards. Another one suggested I trim trees that weren't even on their side of the fence. They always ended with fake cheer smiley faces, phrases like, "Just keeping the neighborhood beautiful, and we appreciate your cooperation." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I wasn't a member. That seemed to bother them more than if I had argued. The messages turned into letters. The letters turned into notices. They started referencing complaints from residents without ever naming who complained. One email told me my equipment looked industrial. Another suggested my chickens were incompatible with suburban living, which was funny considering my land had chickens on it longer than their streets had names. Every communication had the same tone, polite on the surface, condescending underneath, like they were talking to a child who just didn't understand how things worked now. Then the barn plans became public. The moment framing lumber showed up, the pressure spiked. I got a friendly reminder that all exterior structures required HOA approval. When I didn't reply, a follow-up arrived asking me to submit plans within 10 days to avoid enforcement action. Still, no proof of jurisdiction. just assumptions, authority by repetition. What really told me who I was dealing with was the way they talked about history. When I finally replied, calmly explaining that my property was not part of the HOA and never had been, the response was dismissive. I was told records change, boundaries evolve, and that legacy ownership does not exempt anyone from modern standards. That line stuck with me. It wasn't ignorance. It was entitlement. They believed time erased rights. A week later, the certified letter arrived. Inside was an official-looking notice, stamped and signed, stating I had been fined $5,000 for unauthorized construction. It warned that additional daily penalties would follow and that unpaid balances could result in a lien against my property. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the punchline that never came. $5,000 for a barn on land they didn't own, control, or have any legal claim to. That was the moment the situation crossed from annoying to serious. Because an HOA willing to threaten liens without jurisdiction isn't confused. It's dangerous. And standing there in my kitchen, that letter in my hand, I realized something else too. They weren't going to stop on their own. I didn't respond to that first fine with anger. I responded with paperwork, years of it. I sat down at my desk and wrote a calm, detailed email explaining exactly where my property lines were and why the HOA had no authority over them. I attached scanned copies of old tax maps that clearly showed my parcel outlined separately, long before Hollow Creek Estates ever existed. I included a copy of my current property tax bill, which made no reference to any homeowners association. I even added a short, polite paragraph saying I understood mistakes happened and that I was happy to clear it up before things went any further. I genuinely believed that once someone on their board actually read what I sent, this would all end. Instead, the reply I got felt like it was written by a machine programmed to ignore reality. They thanked me for my input, then informed me that community standards and governing documents take precedence over outdated records. They said boundaries had been updated over time and that participation in the community was expected of all adjacent property owners. There was no citation, no map, no explanation, just confidence. The kind that assumes repeating something makes it true. What made it worse was what happened a few days later. I was repairing a fence near the back of my property when a man in a Hollow Creek Estates polo shirt approached the fence line. He didn't introduce himself at first. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. Finally, he said his name was Calvin Price and that he was on the HOA board. His tone was different from Marjorie's, lower, cautious. He told me, quietly, that some people on the board knew my land didn't technically fall under HOA control. He admitted the records were messy and that the subdivision had been built right up against my property without ever formally incorporating it. When I asked why they were still pushing, he hesitated, then said, "Because if they let you slide, it sets a precedent." That word stuck with me. Precedent, not legality, not fairness, just control. Calvin didn't stay long. Before he left, he warned me off the record that things were likely to escalate. He said Marjorie hated backing down and believed pressure solved everything. Then he walked away like a man who didn't want his name attached to what was coming next. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I knew I wasn't. What bothered me was how casually they were threatening consequences they didn't have the power to enforce. Liens, daily fines, legal action. Even if it was all bluff, dealing with it would cost time, money, and stress. I found myself running numbers in my head, wondering how long a fight like this could drag on and how much damage it could do before the truth finally caught up. 3 days later, the second notice arrived. This one was more aggressive. It stated that daily penalties were now accruing and that my outstanding balance would increase every 24 hours until the violation was resolved. The language was colder, sharper, and clearly meant to intimidate. It listed potential further remedies, including legal review and collection procedures. I stood there reading it while the sound of hammers echoed from the barn site outside. The project that was supposed to make my work easier was now the excuse they were using to threaten everything I'd built. That was when something in me shifted. I realized this wasn't going to be settled through polite emails or quiet explanations. They weren't interested in being right. They were interested in winning. So I gathered every document I had, deeds, maps, tax records, correspondence, and put them into a folder. The next morning, instead of replying to the HOA, I got in my truck and drove to the county offices. If the HOA wanted to pretend history didn't matter, I was ready to introduce them to someone who kept records for a living. The county records office sat in a squat brick building that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 70s, which, in that moment, felt reassuring. Places like that don't care about tone or titles, they care about paper. I walked in carrying a folder thick enough to sag and took a number, half expecting to be told I was wasting my time. Instead, when my turn came, I met Linda Hargrove. Linda had the calm, steady demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of dispute imaginable and learned not to be impressed by raised voices or fancy letterheads. She listened while I explained the situation, flipping through my documents slowly, nodding every so often. When I mentioned the year my family acquired the land, her eyebrows lifted just slightly. She excused herself, disappeared into the back, and returned pushing a cart stacked with oversized books bound in worn leather. "These don't get pulled out much anymore," she said, almost fondly. She guided me to a long table and began turning pages with practiced care. There it was, an original deed dated 1889, recorded cleanly and clearly, bearing my great-great-grandfather's name. The ink was faded but legible. The boundaries were described in old survey language, referencing creeks and oak trees that still existed. Linda compared it against modern parcel maps on her computer, tracing lines with her finger. "Your property has never been annexed," she said plainly. "Not into the subdivision, not into any association." To be safe, she called over Tom Alvarez from zoning. Tom was younger, methodical, and refreshingly direct. He reviewed the deed, checked annexation records, and pulled up municipal overlays. His conclusion was even more blunt. "There is zero jurisdiction here," he said. "Your land was never included. It would have required signed covenants or a formal annexation process. Neither happened." Hearing it out loud felt like exhaling after holding my breath for weeks. Tom drafted a written confirmation on official county letterhead stating that my property was not, and never had been, subject to Hollow Creek Estates HOA authority. Linda notarized copies, stamped them, and handed them to me like ammunition. "This should put an end to it," she said. "If they keep pushing, they're the ones with a problem." For the first time since the SUV skidded to a stop at my fence, I felt genuinely calm. That afternoon, I scanned the letter and sent it to the HOA's official email address. No commentary, no argument. Just the document itself. I figured there was nothing left to say. Facts don't need explanations. I waited. 2 days passed, then 3. No response, no apology, no acknowledgement at all. I started to think maybe Linda had been right and this nightmare was finally over. Then, early on the 4th morning, my phone buzzed. It wasn't an apology. It was another notice. The email thanked me for providing additional materials and then stated that the board would be reviewing the matter internally. In the meantime, all enforcement actions would continue to preserve community integrity. Attached was an updated statement showing my balance had increased due to daily penalties. They even added a new line item for administrative processing. I read it twice, stunned. They had the county's confirmation in their hands, and they were choosing to ignore it. Later that day, things got stranger. A laminated notice appeared taped to my fence, visible from the road, stating that my property was under review for compliance. It didn't name the HOA directly, but the logo at the bottom made it obvious who wanted the neighborhood to see it. It felt less like enforcement and more like a public shaming attempt. By that evening, the emails started again. This time, the language was colder. They questioned the validity of the county letter, suggested further review by their legal consultants. One message implied that continuing construction could expose me to additional remedies. It was carefully worded, but the intent was clear. They weren't just refusing to back down. They were digging in. Standing out by the barn as the sun went down, I looked at the frame rising from the ground and felt a mix of disbelief and anger. I had done everything right. I had gone to the proper authority. I had proof older than their entire subdivision, and still, they were pushing as if reality were optional. That was when it hit me that this was no longer about confusion or messy records. It was about power. They believed if they applied enough pressure, I would cave just to make it stop. They were counting on exhaustion. What they didn't realize was that every step they took past that county letter wasn't just harassment, it was evidence. And they were creating a paper trail they couldn't erase. I should have known they wouldn't stop at emails and fines. People who ignore facts don't suddenly grow respectful when they lose on paper. They look for other ways to apply pressure. The first sign came in the form of a bright orange notice stapled to a post near my gate. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county. According to the complaint, my barn construction posed a potential environmental risk, possibly affecting runoff patterns and nearby land. It also claimed I was building without proper permits. The wording was vague, but the implication was serious. If true, it could halt construction completely. I didn't panic. I was annoyed, but not surprised. This was exactly the kind of move someone makes when they realize their authority is imaginary. They try to borrow someone else's. 2 days later, a county truck pulled into my driveway and out stepped Rachel Monroe, an environmental engineer with a clipboard and a tired smile. She told me straight up that she was responding to a complaint and needed to inspect the site. I handed her every permit I had and walked her through the barn frame, the grading, and the drainage plans I'd already followed for years on the property. Rachel didn't rush. She checked slopes, soil conditions, and water flow. She even asked how long the land had been farmed. When I told her it had been in continuous agricultural use since the late 19th century, she paused and shook her head. "There's no violation here," she said, "not even close." A week later, I received her written report. The complaint was unfounded. No environmental risk. No permit issues. Case closed. It should have been the end of it. Instead, that same week, my mailbox disappeared. Not knocked over, not damaged by weather. Gone. Ripped clean out of the ground and hauled off. I stood at the edge of the driveway staring at the empty hole, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't passive aggression anymore. It was deliberate. The next morning, it escalated. As I pulled out of the driveway, I heard the unmistakable crunch of metal under tire. I stopped immediately and got out. Roofing nails were scattered across the gravel like someone had emptied a bag and kicked them around for good measure. Whoever did it knew exactly where I'd drive. Whoever did it didn't care if I got hurt. That was the moment the situation stopped being an HOA dispute and started being something else entirely. I called the sheriff to report the damage, then drove straight into town and bought cameras. Not the obvious kind. Motion-activated trail cameras with night vision, the kind hunters use. I mounted them quietly, aimed at the driveway, the fence line, and the stretch of road near the barn. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten. I just waited. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, the cameras triggered just after 2 in the morning. I reviewed the footage over coffee the next day, my jaw tightening with every second. A figure approached the fence line, careful but not careful enough. When the infrared light caught his face, there was no mistaking him. It was Derek Bell, the HOA president's husband. The footage showed him stepping onto my property, glancing around and moving with purpose. In one clip, he bent down near the driveway where the nails had been scattered before. In another, he lingered by the fence, looking toward the barn as if measuring something. He stayed for several minutes, then left the same way he came. No accident, no misunderstanding. I watched it twice, then a third time, feeling anger rise, but also something steadier beneath it. Relief. Because now, this wasn't my word against theirs. This was video. I took the footage straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty didn't say much as he watched it, but his expression hardened. Trespassing, property damage. Potentially worse. He told me they would follow up. That evening, a cruiser pulled up outside the Bell's house. I didn't need to hear what was said to know it wasn't friendly. The next day, Marjorie Bell avoided eye contact when he drove past my place. The nails stopped appearing. The mailbox was replaced at the HOA's expense after a short, awkward message from their management company. But something had changed. The HOA wasn't just overstepping anymore. They were unraveling. When organizations built on intimidation realize they've crossed into criminal territory, they don't retreat gracefully. They make mistakes. Big ones. Standing in the barn frame that night, listening to the quiet hum of the cameras doing their job, I understood that whatever this had become, there was no going back to normal. The line had been crossed, and now it wasn't just my land on the line. It was their freedom. By the time the emergency HOA meeting was announced, everyone knew it wasn't about landscaping or parking decals. The notice was short, urgent, and strangely vague, which only fueled speculation. When I pulled into the community hall that evening, the parking lot was already overflowing. People stood in clusters outside, whispering, phones in hand, the kind of restless energy you feel right before something breaks. Inside, every chair was filled. Latecomers leaned against the walls. The board sat up front behind a folding table that suddenly looked too small for the weight of what was coming. Marjorie Bell sat in the center, jaw tight, binder in front of her like armor. She didn't look at me when I took a seat near the aisle. The meeting barely started before voices rose. Questions came fast and sharp. Why were dues so high? Why were fines being issued without hearings? Why was the HOA threatening property it didn't own? Marjorie tried to gavel the room into order, but control was already slipping. When public comments opened, I stood. The room quieted, not because they liked me, but because everyone knew why I was there. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I laid documents on the table one by one. The county letter confirming my land was never part of the HOA. The environmental report dismissing the complaint as baseless. Printed stills from the camera footage, timestamps clear, Marjorie Bell visible under night vision as he crossed onto my property. Gasps rippled through the room. I explained how fines had been issued anyway, how daily penalties accrued despite official confirmation, how enforcement fees appeared without explanation. I didn't accuse. I let the paper do it for me. Each page landed heavier than the last. That was when Martha Collins stood up. She was quiet, gray-haired, and had lived in Hollow Creek Estates longer than most of the board. Until that moment, few people knew she'd spent 3 decades working as a paralegal, specializing in property and association law. She didn't posture. She spoke plainly. She explained how HOAs are bound by their own governing documents, how jurisdiction is everything, and how ignoring county determinations wasn't just improper. It was dangerous. She pointed out inconsistencies in the financial summaries the board had released over the years. Vague categories, repeated legal review expenses without corresponding cases. Enforcement actions that never went through required procedures. As she spoke, several board members started flipping through their own packets, faces paling. Marjorie snapped. She interrupted Martha, accused her of grandstanding, then turned on me, claiming I was manipulating the room and spreading misinformation. The problem was, she wasn't arguing facts anymore. She was arguing tone. And everyone could see it. One board member asked about the landscaping contract Martha mentioned. Another asked why enforcement costs had doubled in a single year with no increase in violations. Marjorie dodged, deflected. Finally, she lost her temper entirely and told the room they wouldn't understand the complexity of HOA management. That was the moment she lost them. A resident called for a vote to commission an independent financial audit. Another seconded it immediately. Marjorie tried to rule it out of order. Martha calmly corrected her, citing the exact bylaw that allowed residents to force an audit with a majority present. Hands went up across the room. The vote wasn't close. The motion passed. The room fell silent, not with relief, but with realization. People were starting to understand that whatever this audit found wouldn't just explain my situation. It would explain years of unease they brushed aside. The meeting adjourned abruptly after that, the board retreating without ceremony. As people filed out, conversations buzzed low and intense. I overheard words like fraud, abuse, and how long has this been happening? No one was talking about my barn anymore. Outside, Martha caught up with me and said quietly, "If even half of what I suspect is true, this goes way beyond you." I looked back at the hall, lights still on, board members huddled inside. For the first time, I realized the barn hadn't caused the explosion. It had just lit the fuse. The audit results didn't come with drama or warning. They landed quietly in inboxes late on a Tuesday afternoon, attached to a plain email with the subject line reading simply, "Independent Financial Review." By nightfall, Hollow Creek Estates felt like a shaken beehive. People started reading, then rereading, then forwarding screenshots to neighbors with messages like, "Have you seen this? And this can't be real." What the audit uncovered wasn't sloppy bookkeeping or minor mistakes. It was systematic abuse. Thousands of dollars were listed under enforcement expenses tied to violations that never existed. Legal consultation fees were paid month after month, yet no corresponding cases could be found. A landscaping contract, supposedly awarded through a competitive process, turned out to belong to a company registered under a relative of Marjorie Bell. The prices were inflated, the work inconsistent, and the approvals signed by her alone. Even worse, there were line items labeled compliance monitoring that matched the exact weeks I had been fined, threatened, and reported. The barn wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the one that finally left fingerprints. By the end of the week, the audit had been forwarded to the state. That part moved faster than anyone expected. Investigators requested records. Subpoenas followed. The HOA's management company abruptly distanced itself, issuing a statement that they had acted based on information provided by the board. Translation: they were backing away as quickly as possible. An emergency meeting was called, but this time it wasn't about debate. It was about damage control. Residents packed the room again, only now the mood was different. There was no shouting, no confusion, just anger sharpened by clarity. Marjorie Bell tried to speak. She stood, adjusted her papers, and opened her mouth to explain how difficult leadership could be. She never finished the first sentence. Someone held up a page from the audit and read aloud one of the expense summaries. Another followed with a question about the landscaping contract. A third asked why dues had increased while reserves had vanished. Marjorie's voice rose. Then cracked. For the first time, she sounded defensive instead of authoritative. She blamed misunderstandings, claimed accounting errors, said she had acted in the community's best interest. No one believed her. The vote to remove her as president was swift and decisive. No speeches, no hesitation. When the results were announced, she sat down slowly, staring at the table as if it had betrayed her. The binder that once looked like a weapon now looked useless. Derek Bell's situation unraveled just as quickly. The charges stemming from the camera footage moved forward without delay. Trespass, vandalism, the mailbox, the nails. There was no room for interpretation. The evidence was clear. When the paperwork was served, word spread fast, and whatever sympathy might have existed evaporated. Then the state acted. The HOA was fined for financial misconduct and placed under suspension pending further review. Enforcement authority was frozen. No new fines, no penalties, no threats. The very machinery that had been used to intimidate people was shut off overnight. What hit me hardest, though, wasn't watching Marjorie lose her title or seeing the HOA stripped of power. It was what happened afterward. Neighbors started coming up to me. Some awkwardly, some openly embarrassed. One woman apologized for filing a complaint about noise that she admitted she never actually cared about. A man told me he had assumed the HOA knew what it was doing and felt foolish for not questioning it sooner. Others simply said, "Thank you." At the next informal gathering, someone said out loud what everyone had been thinking. "You weren't the problem. You were the warning." That was the moment everything settled into place. For weeks, I had been painted as stubborn, difficult, uncooperative. Standing there among people who finally saw the truth, I realized how easily that narrative had been built and how fragile it really was. All it took was proof and the courage to look at it. As the sun set that evening, I walked back toward my land, the unfinished barn silhouetted against the sky. It stood exactly where it always had, unmoved by binders, threats, or fake authority. The structure hadn't changed. The people had. And in the quiet that followed the collapse of the HOA's control, there was a shared understanding that felt heavier than any fine they had tried to levy. I had been right, not because I fought louder, not because I won harder, but because the truth, once dragged into the open, refused to go back into the dark. Once the state suspension became official, everything moved quickly and quietly, the way real consequences usually do. Hollow Creek Estates didn't explode or collapse in a dramatic way. It simply stopped functioning. The enforcement notices disappeared. The email inbox went silent. The management company terminated its contract, citing compliance concerns. Within weeks, the HOA voted to dissolve rather than attempt reinstatement under state oversight. Oversight of the neighborhood shifted back to the county, where it should have been all along. Roads, utilities, and basic regulations were handled through existing township ordinances. No binders, no fines by email, no surprise penalties taped to fences. Just clear rules that applied equally to everyone. The relief was almost immediate. People didn't realize how tightly wound they'd been until the pressure was gone. The civil side of things followed a steadier path. Through attorneys, a settlement was reached that covered the damage to my property, the cost of replacing the mailbox, vehicle repairs from the nails, and the legal fees I'd been forced to take on just to defend land I already owned. There was also compensation for harassment, which still felt strange to accept, but my lawyer reminded me that accountability mattered, not just for me, but to prevent this from happening again. By the time the paperwork was finalized, the barn was nearly complete. I finished it the way I'd always planned. Red siding, white trim, solid doors that swung smoothly on their hinges. When the last board went up, I stood back and looked at it for a long time. What had once been labeled a violation had become something else entirely. Neighbors started referring to it as a landmark. Kids asked questions about the animals. People stopped by for eggs and stayed to talk longer than they needed to. The apologies came slowly, and then all at once. Some neighbors were awkward, shuffling their feet as they admitted they'd believed what the HOA told them. Others were more direct, saying they regretted not speaking up sooner. A few confessed they'd been afraid to question authority because it seemed easier to go along with it. I didn't hold any of it against them. Control systems don't survive without silence, and silence usually comes from fear, not malice. Conversations replaced complaints. Fences got fixed together instead of argued over. The mood of the place shifted from guarded to open in a way I hadn't realized was possible. Without constant enforcement hovering in the background, people relaxed. They waved more. They talked more. They talked more. The neighborhood finally felt like a community instead of a checklist. Martha Collins became an unexpected symbol of that change. When the Township Advisory Board opened a seat, residents encouraged her to run. She resisted at first, but eventually agreed, saying someone needed to make sure transparency wasn't just a temporary phase. She won easily. At her first meeting, she pushed for clearer reporting requirements and better public access to records. Watching her work felt like proof that something good had come out of all this. As for Marjorie and Bell, their names stopped coming up. People didn't speculate much about where they went or what they were doing. Once the power was gone, the interest went with it. That, more than anything, felt like the right ending for them. The anger I'd carried for months didn't disappear overnight, but it softened. It lost its edge. Standing in the barn one evening, tools put away, animals settling in for the night, I realized I wasn't replaying arguments in my head anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next letter or email. The quiet felt earned. I hadn't set out to challenge an HOA or expose misconduct. I just wanted to build a barn on land my family had cared for longer than anyone could remember. What I learned along the way was that standing your ground doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just requires refusing to accept a lie, even when it's delivered with confidence and letterhead. Looking out over the field as the sun dipped low, I felt something I hadn't felt since the first fine arrived. Peace. Not the loud kind that comes with victory, but the steady kind that settles in when things are finally put back where they belong. I sometimes stand inside that barn at dusk when the air cools and the noise of the day finally fades. The wood creaks softly as it settles, the way old structures do, and the light slips in through the gaps just enough to remind me how solid it all is. Looking at it now, it's hard to believe how much chaos something so ordinary caused. But the truth is, this was never really about a barn. It was about boundaries, about what happens when people decide that authority matters more than truth, and that confidence can replace consent. The HOA didn't lose because they were loud or rude. They lost because they ignored paper, history, and the quiet systems designed to protect regular people from exactly that kind of overreach. What carried me through wasn't bravado or clever arguments. It was patience. It was keeping records. It was knowing when to stop explaining myself and let proof speak instead. Deeds don't get tired. Documents don't get intimidated. And when you let them do the talking, the noise eventually dies down on its own. Standing there in the fading light, I don't feel angry anymore. I don't feel vindictive. I feel grounded. The land is still here. The barn is doing what it was built to do. And the power that once tried to push past its limits is gone. If there's anything this experience taught me, it's that you don't have to surrender your rights just because someone else prints rules in bold letters. Calm persistence beats control every time. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?